The Girl in the Rain. The night was wrapped in a silver mist, as if the city of Los Angeles had decided to drape itself in a quiet sadness. The rain wasn't loud. It whispered as it fell, barely enough to soak through clothes, yet enough to make the world feel heavier. People walked faster in the drizzle, umbrellas blooming like black flowers on the sidewalks, each person caught up in their own bubble of appointments, reservations, and plans. The city never truly stopped moving, not even when it cried. Just off Rodeo Drive, glowing like a jewel against the gloomy night, stood Étoile d'Or, the kind of restaurant that existed more in magazines than reality. Its gold-lettered name shimmered above the doors like a promise. Luxury, exclusivity, perfection. Here, behind those glass walls, was a different world. One of laughter over wine glasses, silk dresses, diamond watches, and dishes so delicate they were described more like paintings than food. Inside, time slowed for the privileged. Outside, it didn't care who you were. And on this strange, wet evening, Keanu Reeves stepped out of a black SUV just across the street from the restaurant. His presence, as always, was quiet. There was no entourage, no assistant rushing to open doors. He wore a black beanie, a long coat, and his usual humble demeanor. If you didn't know who he was, you wouldn't have guessed he was one of Hollywood's most beloved actors. And if you did recognize him, you'd probably be surprised by how simple he kept things. He glanced across the street. Étoile d'Or shimmered through the rain, warm and glowing like a lantern in the dark. He wasn't here for publicity, or even for a fancy dinner. He had promised an old friend, his stunt double from one of his earliest films, that he'd finally meet him after years of missed connections. The two had planned to catch up over dinner, reminiscing about broken bones, long shooting nights, and the roads they'd taken since. But as Keanu stepped off the curb, something made him stop. There, just to the right of the restaurant entrance, beneath the dim flicker of a street lamp, sat a girl. She couldn't have been older than 15. Her clothes were damp and too thin for the cold, her knees hugged tightly to her chest, as if trying to shrink herself from the world. Her hair was stringy with rain, clinging to her cheeks. A tattered backpack sat beside her, its contents pressed against its seams like it held everything she owned. But what caught Keanu the most was her face. Not dirty or bruised, not angry or begging, just still. She stared into the restaurant, her eyes wide open, like someone looking into a world that wasn't meant for her. She wasn't panhandling. She wasn't drawing attention to herself. She didn't even look around for help. She just sat in the rain, her gaze fixed, her mouth unmoving, her spirit almost invisible. For a moment, Keanu simply watched. People passed her by. A woman in a silk dress stepped around her without a second glance. A man in a tailored suit frowned as if she were an inconvenience on the sidewalk. No one said anything. No one asked. No one cared. But Keanu cared. He didn't fully understand why. But something about her presence in that place, at that time, in that silent sadness, stirred something in him. It reminded him of something buried deep, a night from his past, a version of himself that had once sat alone on a sidewalk, heartbroken, after losing someone he loved, the feeling of being surrounded by lights and laughter and people, and still feeling completely alone. He crossed the street slowly, walked past the velvet ropes and luxury cars, and made his way to her. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling down beside her so he wouldn't loom over her. "You all right?" The girl flinched slightly, startled, not by fear, but by the rarity of someone stopping. She blinked up at him, her lips parting like she was about to say something, but unsure if she should. "I'm okay," she said quietly. "You don't have to talk to me." Keanu tilted his head gently. "Maybe I don't, but I want to." The girl looked down at her shoes, soaked and scuffed. "You don't even know me." "That's true," Keanu said with a warm chuckle. "But sometimes that makes it easier to talk, don't you think?" There was a silence between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people know they're sharing a moment they'll remember, even if they can't explain why. I'm not homeless, she said suddenly, her voice firmer. I mean, I sort of am, but not really. I'm just waiting. Waiting for someone. Keanu asked gently. She shook her head. Not anymore. He studied her face. She was pale beneath the city lights, with tired eyes that had seen too much. But beneath the weariness, there was something else, a flicker of resilience, of survival. A meal she'll never forget. The warm mug of hot chocolate steamed between Emily's hands like a miracle. Her fingers, red from the cold, clutched the porcelain as though it might vanish at any second. The whipped cream melted slowly into the drink, creating swirls she stared at with the quiet intensity of someone who hadn't seen comfort in a long time. Keanu watched her with a calm that didn't ask questions. He'd always understood the power of silence, not as a void, but as a space where people could feel safe to speak when they were ready. His plate of risotto sat untouched as Emily took slow sips of her hot chocolate, her eyes scanning the gold-drenched dining room with disbelief. You ever been somewhere like this? He asked softly, not to show off, but just to invite her into the present moment. She shook her head. I've seen it on TV. I always thought if you didn't wear something fancy, they'd kick you out before you even touched the doorknob. Keanu smiled. They probably would, if you weren't with someone who looked like they belonged. A pause. Then Emily looked at him curiously. Why did you help me? That question, it landed like a stone on the table between them. Direct, honest. Keanu leaned back in the booth, considering. Because once, a long time ago, he said, someone did the same for me. And I never forgot how that felt. Emily looked down at her lap. But I didn't even ask. That's exactly why I stopped, he replied. You didn't have to. Another silence, but this one settled with a bit more comfort. The tension that had tightened her shoulders since she'd walked in was beginning to loosen. Slowly, like thawing ice. She ran her fingers along the edge of the mug. I didn't run away from home, if that's what you're thinking. I mean, I did, but not because I was being dramatic or trying to make trouble. I didn't think that, Keanu said, his voice gentle. I don't think anything until someone tells me their story. That caught her off guard. She glanced at him, studying his face, searching for signs of judgment, pity, anything. But there was none. Just the quiet patience of someone who knew that everyone carried a burden they didn't show the world. My mom's sick, she said after a long pause. Like, really sick. She's been in the hospital for months. I was staying with her best friend, but things got weird. She had her own life, and didn't really want me around. She said she was doing me a favor. I guess I just left before she could kick me out. Keanu's eyes softened, his heart quietly breaking behind them. What about your dad? He asked gently. I've never met him, she said quickly, as if rehearsed. Don't even know his name. Mom never talked about him much. Do you know where your mom is now? She nodded. County General. She's on a waiting list for some kind of surgery. They say she's stable, but no one tells me much anymore. I tried to visit yesterday, but they wouldn't let me in because I don't have ID. Or a guardian. I just sat outside her window for a bit, hoping she'd wake up. Keanu took a breath, letting her words settle. How long have you been on your own? She hesitated. 4 weeks, maybe 5. And you've been staying? Wherever, she said with a shrug. Park benches, once behind a 24-hour laundromat. It's not so bad if you stay where people don't see you. The worst part is feeling like I'm not even real anymore. Those words, not even real, hit Keanu like a gut punch. He thought about how fame had sometimes made him feel the opposite. Too real, too visible. But being invisible, that was another kind of pain entirely. You're real to me, he said, reaching across the table and tapping his knuckles gently against her mug. Emily blinked, caught between tears and a smile. This is crazy, she whispered. I mean, you're Keanu Reeves. You should be in a movie right now, or I don't know, Doing something important. I'm exactly where I need to be, he said. Just then, the waiter returned with their meals. Keanu had ordered her a roasted chicken with mashed potatoes and vegetables. It was the kind of dish that smelled like home, like comfort. Emily stared at it, overwhelmed. I can't eat all that, she said. You don't have to, Keanu replied. Just eat what you want. She picked up her fork, slowly, cautiously, like the food might disappear if she moved too fast. The first bite hit her like a wave. She closed her eyes for a second, chewing slowly. Keanu smiled as he watched her shoulders lower further, the weight of the day starting to slip away with every bite. I used to cook this with my mom, she murmured. We'd get the cheap chicken thighs and use leftover veggies. She always made sure I had the biggest piece. She sounds like someone who loves you a lot, Keanu said. She's the only person who ever really did, Emily whispered. They sat there for nearly an hour. The rain outside turned to a soft mist. The noise in the restaurant faded into background music, and in that corner booth, the world paused. A young girl who had been forgotten was finally being heard, and a man who had lived through pain of his own saw something of his past reflected in her eyes. As they finished eating, Emily leaned back, full for the first time in weeks. So what happens now? She asked. Keanu thought for a moment. Well, first, I'd like to get you a safe place to sleep tonight. Then, maybe tomorrow, we can visit your mom together. And after that, we figure things out, together. Emily didn't respond right away. She stared at the empty plate, then up at him. Why are you really doing this? Keanu leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low. Because someone once gave me hope when I didn't believe in anything anymore. And I promised myself, if I ever saw someone standing in the rain the way I once did, I'd stop. She didn't say anything for a long while. Then, slowly, she reached across the table and placed her small hand over his. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me. And in that moment, nothing else in the restaurant mattered. Not the fame, not the luxury, not the judgmental glances from nearby tables. Just two souls, one lost, one healing, finding each other at the exact moment they needed to. As they walked out together under the night sky, Keanu held an umbrella over both of them. Emily looked up at him, the corner of her mouth lifting in a smile that hadn't seen daylight in months. Do you think things can get better? She asked. I know they can, he said, because they just did. The hospital window. Morning arrived like a breath of fresh hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily had slept on a real bed, under a real roof. Not concrete, not benches, not the cold metal frame of a bus stop, but clean sheets, a soft pillow, and the kind of quiet that wrapped around her like a lullaby. Keanu had checked her into a small boutique hotel not far from the hospital. Nothing extravagant, just a safe space. He'd even waited in the lobby until she fell asleep, giving her the reassurance that she wasn't alone anymore. When she woke up, there was a note beside the bed. Meet me in the lobby at 9. We'll go see your mom together. Key. She clutched the note for a moment, blinking away the disbelief. There was a strange feeling forming in her chest, something she hadn't dared to feel in weeks, something that scared her more than the streets ever had. Hope. Downstairs, Keanu was already waiting with 2 warm bagels, a cup of tea, and a smile that asked nothing of her. No pressure, no questions, just presence. You ready? He asked. She nodded, her backpack slung tightly over one shoulder. The ride to County General was quiet. Outside the windows, the city was waking up, cars honking, people rushing to wherever their lives demanded they be. But in Keanu's car, it was calm. He didn't fill the silence with empty talk. He let her sit with her thoughts, allowed the nervous energy to come and go. When they arrived at the hospital, Emily hesitated at the front doors. They won't let me in, she murmured. I tried before. They said I wasn't on any approved list. I don't even have ID. Keanu didn't say anything at first. He simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone this time." At the front desk, he spoke gently but firmly to the nurse behind the counter. "This young lady is here to visit her mother, Catherine Dawes, in the cardiac unit. I'll stay with her the entire time." The nurse glanced at him, recognition flashing in her eyes. It wasn't just the name, it was his voice. Calm, centered, uncheckably sincere. "Let me call up," the nurse said, already dialing. A few minutes later, a woman in scrubs approached them. "You're lucky," she said to Emily with a small smile. "Your mom had a stable night. She's awake and asking for someone. Come on, I'll take you up." Emily turned to Keanu. "You'll come too." "I'll be right beside you," he said. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. With every floor they passed, Emily's heartbeat quickened. The last time she'd seen her mom, she looked like she was made of paper, fragile, too still, tubes and machines doing the work her heart no longer could. Emily hadn't been allowed in the room. She had watched from the hallway window until a nurse had asked her to leave. Now, as the elevator doors opened onto the cardiac wing, that familiar fear crept back in, but Keanu's presence steadied her. They turned the corner, passed several rooms, and finally reached room 418. Inside, Catherine Dawes lay in bed, pale but alive. Her eyes fluttered open the moment she heard footsteps, and when she saw her daughter. "Emily," she whispered, her voice raspy but full of emotion. "Mom," Emily breathed, rushing to her side. Keanu quietly stepped back, allowing them space. He stood near the window, watching the reunion unfold with a softness in his eyes few ever got to see. "I thought they wouldn't let you in," Catherine said, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I kept asking, but they didn't listen." "I met someone," Emily said, glancing toward Keanu. "He helped me." Catherine's gaze shifted. Recognition flickered, then confusion. "Wait, is that?" Keanu stepped forward, smiling gently. "Hi, I'm Keanu. Just a friend. A very lucky one." Catherine's eyes welled up. "Why would you help us?" "I've seen enough pain in this world to know when someone needs a hand," he said. "You don't need to do anything to deserve help. Sometimes, you just need someone to care." Tears spilled silently from the corners of Catherine's eyes. "People don't talk like that anymore." "They should," Keanu replied. The nurse came in a moment later to check vitals, giving them a few minutes of privacy. Keanu stepped out into the hallway, letting the mother and daughter reconnect. He stood by the window, hands in his coat pockets, staring out over the city. So many lives behind those windows, so many stories unfolding. When he turned back, Emily was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, holding her mother's hand, telling her everything that had happened. Her time alone, the night in the rain, the dinner they'd shared. Catherine's face twisted with worry and guilt. "You shouldn't have had to go through all that," she said. "I'm so sorry." "You don't need to be sorry," Emily replied. "You were trying to survive too." Keanu quietly returned to the room, taking the seat near the window. "There's something I'd like to do," he said, "if you'll let me." Catherine looked at him, wary. "What is it?" "I want to make sure you both have what you need. A better place to stay. Meals, whatever helps until you're strong again." "We can't accept that," Catherine said quickly. "We don't take handouts." "It's not a handout," Keanu said softly. "It's a promise. From one human being to another. I've had more than my share of help in life, and this is how I pay it forward." Emily looked at her mother. "Please, just let him." Catherine hesitated, then nodded. For the rest of the day, they talked. Keanu called in a few favors, arranged for a social worker to meet with them, connected Catherine with a foundation he secretly funded that helped cover medical bills for low-income families. He even got Emily temporarily enrolled in an after-school art program. She had mentioned, offhand, that she liked to draw. It wasn't about fixing everything overnight. It was about believing in someone long enough to help them believe in themselves again. As the sun began to set outside the hospital room window, Emily leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her fingers still wrapped in hers. Keanu stood, ready to leave. "Will you come back?" Emily asked. He smiled. "You couldn't keep me away." And as he walked down the long hallway, something in his chest stirred again. That quiet ache of connection. The reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could change the trajectory of an entire life. Because sometimes the people we stop for are the people who save us in return. Headlines and hidden truths. The following morning, the sun broke through the clouds like a long-awaited promise. For once, the light didn't feel harsh. It painted the hospital room in golden warmth, catching in the corners where shadows had lingered for too long. Catherine was resting peacefully, her breathing steadier than the day before, and Emily sat beside her mother's bed, sketching quietly in a new notebook Keanu had bought her from a nearby art store. The hospital's social worker, a kind woman named Teresa, had already been in that morning. Keanu had arranged for temporary guardianship paperwork to be processed, something that would allow Emily to stay with her mother once she was discharged and help them qualify for housing support. Catherine had cried quietly when Teresa had explained everything. Not because of the paperwork, but because she couldn't remember the last time someone had gone to that kind of trouble for them. Downstairs in the hospital cafe, Keanu sat alone at a small table, sipping black coffee and reading from a worn paperback novel. He hadn't slept much, but that didn't bother him. What mattered was that Emily and Catherine were safe. For now. But peace, as he well knew, rarely came without complications. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, expecting a message from his assistant, or perhaps a check-in from the hotel manager regarding Emily's things. But what he saw instead made his heart drop into his stomach. Keanu Reeves spotted with young girl at hospital. Secret fatherhood or rescue mission. The tabloid headline glared at him from a gossip site's front page. Below it was a blurry zoom lens photo taken from across the street. Him walking beside Emily outside the hospital, his hand gently resting on her shoulder, both of them looking tired but somehow at peace. The caption below the photo was even worse. "A mystery girl, possibly homeless, has been seen in the company of beloved actor Keanu Reeves over the past 48 hours. Is this the beginning of a surprising personal story, or is the actor preparing for a new film role?" Keanu sighed deeply, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had lived with fame long enough to understand how fast stories could twist into something unrecognizable. But this time, it wasn't just his own privacy at stake. It was Emily's and Catherine's. He stood up, tossed the coffee into the bin, and headed upstairs. When he returned to the hospital room, Emily looked up from her drawing, a soft smile lighting her face. "I made you something," she said, holding up a rough pencil sketch. It was him, standing in the rain, holding an umbrella over a girl sitting on the sidewalk. Keanu blinked, genuinely touched. "That's amazing, Emily. You're incredibly talented." She shrugged. "I just draw what I see." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. Another message. Then another. He silenced it quickly. Emily tilted her head. "Is everything okay?" Keanu debated for a second, then sat down beside her. Something happened. A photo of us got posted online. Her face fell. "Are they saying bad things?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. Just making guesses. Gossip sites. They don't know the truth, but they're going to try and turn this into something it's not." Emily looked down, suddenly small again. "Are you mad?" Keanu reached out and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Of course not. None of this is your fault. If anything, I'm sorry. I should have known this could happen. But I won't let anyone twist your story." She looked up, eyes wide. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to take control of the narrative," Keanu said firmly. "Not with drama. Not with headlines. Just truth." That afternoon, Keanu called in a favor from a journalist he trusted, a woman named Claire Bennett who had written compassionate pieces about child homelessness and mental health. He invited her to the hospital, sat her down with Catherine and Emily, and let them speak. It wasn't about defending himself. It was about giving them a voice. Claire listened with patience and grace, asking only the questions that mattered. She wrote notes slowly, never interrupting. When Emily told her story, she included details she hadn't told even Keanu, like the time she'd been turned away from a shelter because she didn't look desperate enough, or how she'd sometimes pretended to read in public libraries just to feel normal. Catherine, still weak but gaining strength, shared how she'd worked 3 jobs before the illness, trying to give her daughter a better life. How she'd avoided hospitals for years because she didn't have insurance. How, when her heart had finally given out, she'd been more afraid of losing Emily than losing her own life. And Keanu. He sat quietly through most of the interview, only speaking when Claire asked him why he'd gotten involved. "I saw someone who reminded me of myself," he said simply. "A version of me, sitting in the rain. And I couldn't walk past that. No one should." The article went live the next morning. Keanu Reeves steps in to help homeless teen and her sick mother. A real-life act of kindness. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't clickbait. It was raw, true, and full of humanity. Claire included Emily's drawing. She changed names for privacy, but the core remained. The story spread like wildfire, not because it was scandalous, but because people were hungry for goodness. Messages began flooding in. Offers for help, housing leads, job referrals, art scholarships. People from across the country wrote letters, emails, comments, sharing their own stories of struggle, their admiration for Emily's strength, their appreciation for Keanu's quiet compassion. And for the first time in a long time, Emily smiled without hesitation. But in the background, something else was stirring. A name had appeared in one of the letters, a letter that had no return address. A short, handwritten note. "I read the story. I think I know who Emily's father is. I've wondered for years. I'm sorry for waiting so long. If this reaches the right people, please tell her. I never stopped thinking about her." It was unsigned. Keanu read the note 3 times before telling Catherine. She went pale, clutching the edge of the hospital blanket. "I thought he was gone forever," she whispered. "I thought he didn't want to be found." Emily wasn't told yet, not because they wanted to hide it, but because they weren't sure how. Not until they were certain. Not until the truth had a name. Keanu sat in the hallway again that evening, watching the world darken through the window. He felt the story deepening, as if fate had decided this was more than a chance meeting. There was more ahead, more healing, more uncovering, more purpose. He had come across a girl in the rain. But maybe, just maybe, the universe had brought them together for something much bigger. The letter without a name. The letter sat in Keanu's jacket pocket like a whisper that wouldn't stop. He'd read it at least a dozen times, each word carrying more weight than the last. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain, like someone afraid of what they were about to reveal. There was no return address, no signature, just one sentence that had shattered the stillness. "I think I know who Emily's father is." For Keanu, who had spent his life navigating fame, grief, and privacy, this kind of message carried layers. He knew what it was to long for closure and to fear the cost of truth. And he also knew that for Emily, this could either open a new chapter or reopen old wounds. At first, he didn't tell her. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because she was just starting to settle into something like safety. She'd returned to school part-time through a flexible program and had started visiting her mom every afternoon. The small hotel room Keanu had rented for them had become a temporary home, filled with her drawings taped to the wall and books scattered across the floor. But the letter burned in his pocket. He needed answers before he gave her questions. And so he asked Claire, the journalist who had helped them share their story, to help him track the letter's origin. Claire had a quiet knack for following invisible threads. She read the letter, held it under the light, studied the paper like it carried secrets in its texture. This isn't from someone fishing for attention. she said softly. It feels personal, honest. Together, they traced the postmark to a small town 2 hours outside of Leh. The envelope had been dropped in a blue mailbox on a quiet street, near a gas station and a rundown apartment complex. Claire made a few phone calls, spoke to a clerk at the post office, and eventually narrowed it down to a man named David Kane, a retired mechanic who had once lived in LA nearly 16 years ago. Keanu drove out there himself. He found David in a modest bungalow with peeling paint and a rusted mailbox. The man who answered the door looked like life had worn him down. His shoulders hunched, his eyes tired, but still kind. Keanu introduced himself gently, explained the letter, and watched as David's face paled. "I didn't think anyone would take it seriously," David said. I didn't know what else to do." He invited Keanu in. Inside, the home was quiet, sparse. On the coffee table sat a single photograph, an old Polaroid of a young woman holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. "That's Catherine," David said, picking it up with trembling hands. "And that's the baby I never got to know." Keanu listened as David told his story. He and Catherine had been together briefly, a summer romance. He was working at an auto shop. She was a waitress at a diner. They were young, hopeful, and reckless with their hearts. When she told him she was pregnant, he panicked. Not out of cruelty, but fear. His own father had walked out on him, and he believed, deep down, that he'd do the same. So he left before he had the chance. Years passed. Regret bloomed like rust. He tried to find her again once, but she had moved. And when he finally saw her face in the online article about Keanu and Emily, his heart stopped. "I knew it the second I saw her," David said. "That girl, she's mine. She has Catherine's eyes. But that quiet stubbornness, that's me." Keanu didn't promise anything. He simply thanked him, left with a copy of the photo, and drove back to the city with 100 thoughts swirling in his mind. The next morning, he sat with Catherine in her hospital room, the photo resting gently in his hands. She stared at it for a long time. Her face was unreadable. Pain, nostalgia, guilt, and confusion all tangled together. "I never told Emily," she said finally. "Not because I wanted to hide him. I just didn't want her to grow up waiting for someone who might never come." "I understand," Keanu said, "but he's here now. He wants to meet her. The question is, should we let him?" Catherine closed her eyes. "Only if she wants to." That afternoon, Keanu sat with Emily in the hospital cafeteria. She had a sketchpad open, doodling quietly. Her trust in him had grown unshakable. He didn't want to break it, but she deserved to know. "I have something to tell you," he said gently. She looked up. "I found someone who might be your father." Her eyes widened. The pencil dropped from her hand. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the photograph, and placed it on the table. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "His name is David. He's not perfect. He made mistakes, but he came forward. He wants to meet you." Emily stared at the photo. "He left her. He left me." Keanu nodded. "He did. But sometimes people leave because they're scared, not because they don't care." Silence stretched between them. Then softly, she said, "I want to see him, but I want you there." Keanu reached across the table, wrapped his hand over hers. "Always." The meeting was arranged a few days later, in a quiet community center, not a hospital, not a coffee shop. Neutral ground. David sat at a table, nervously wringing his hands. Emily entered slowly, Keanu beside her. Their eyes met across the room. Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition not of features, but of something older, the strange, aching pull of blood. David stood. "Hi, Emily," he said, voice trembling. I'm your dad." She didn't run to him. She didn't cry. She just stood there, her hands shaking at her sides. "Why now?" she asked. He swallowed. Because I've been a coward most of my life. But I couldn't keep running. Not after seeing you. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want a chance to be part of your life, if you'll let me. Emily looked at Keanu, then back at David. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said, but I want to understand. That was enough. They sat, talked, laughed, even in moments. David gave her a small box. Inside were a few old photos of him as a young man, a necklace he had kept from his mother, and a letter he had written years ago, but never sent. By the end of the hour, something had shifted. Not a full reconciliation, but the start of one. Afterward, as Keanu drove Emily home, she looked out the window for a long time, then said quietly, "Thank you for everything. If you hadn't stopped that night, none of this would have happened." Keanu smiled. Sometimes, the smallest choices change everything. She turned to him. "What about you? Who saved you when you needed someone?" Keanu paused. Then he said, "A woman named Jennifer. She gave me a place to stay when I was 17 and had nowhere to go. She taught me how to be kind even when I was angry. I owe her everything." Emily nodded. "Sounds like you paid it forward." Keanu looked out at the horizon. "Not yet," he said, "but I'm trying." The bridge between strangers. Spring in Los Angeles arrived with a whisper. The cherry trees near the hospital had begun to bloom, their pale petals floating down like promises from the sky. Inside room 418, sunlight poured in through the window, where Catherine Dawes now sat upright for the first time in weeks. Her cheeks had color again, her voice stronger with each passing day. The surgery had gone well. Her heart, once failing, was now beating with steady rhythm. A second chance she had thought would never come. Emily sat beside her, reading aloud from a book she had borrowed from the hospital library. Her voice danced gently through the room. She paused every so often to glance up, checking on her mother, like she'd done since the first day they were reunited, not out of fear, but out of a new habit formed by love. Outside the room, Keanu stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall with a cup of coffee in hand. He was dressed simply, as always, but something in his expression had changed. He looked tired, but the good kind of tired. The kind you feel after a long journey that mattered. Over the past few weeks, everything had slowly begun to shift. Emily had started attending school again. Not full-time, but enough to feel grounded. Her love for art had blossomed with new intensity, thanks in part to a local nonprofit that had offered her a full-year scholarship to an art mentorship program after reading Claire's article. David, her father, had begun showing up once a week. Not too much, just enough. He was quiet, awkward, and deeply unsure of himself. But he showed up, and that was more than Emily ever thought she'd get. As for Catherine, she was on the waiting list for subsidized housing now, approved for a transitional care program that would allow her to heal without worrying about rent or bills for at least 6 months. Keanu had made sure of that, without ever taking credit. One afternoon, while Emily was at school, Keanu walked into Catherine's room with 2 cups of tea. She smiled. "I'm not sure how to thank you." "You don't need to," Keanu said, handing her a cup. "This isn't charity. It's just humanity." "You could have walked past her," Catherine said quietly. "That night, everyone else did." Keanu nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I almost did." "What made you stop?" He sipped his tea. "Because I saw myself in her, not literally. But I remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to sit alone and wonder if anyone would ever look past the surface." Catherine's eyes softened. "You changed her life." Keanu shook his head. "No, I just reminded her of who she already was." Later that week, Emily asked if they could visit a park, just her and Keanu. He agreed, and they found themselves walking through Griffith Park beneath a sky so blue it looked unreal. The city stretched below them, glittering in the distance. Tourists wandered by, some recognizing Keanu but most too caught up in their own pictures to care. They found a bench near a quiet overlook and sat in silence for a while. "I used to think my life was just one long mess," Emily said, "like everything was just happening to me. And I didn't have a say." Keanu looked at her gently. "That's a hard place to be." She nodded. "But now, it's like I can breathe again. Like I get to choose who I become." He smiled. "You've always had that power." She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with a bracelet made of string. "Do you think people can really change, even after everything they've done?" "I think people can choose to become better," he said. "It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about building something new with what's left." Emily looked up at him. "And what about you? Are you building something new?" Keanu paused, then chuckled softly. "Maybe. I don't know if I've ever really stopped rebuilding. Life keeps breaking you open, but each time, there's more light that gets in." She smiled at that. They sat there a while longer, watching the sun dip below the horizon. As the light began to fade, Emily pulled out her sketchbook. Inside was a drawing she had worked on for days. Her mother, smiling in her hospital bed. Her father, sitting beside her awkwardly but present. Herself, standing between them, holding both their hands. And behind them, in the distance, was Keanu. Not in a spotlight. Not a superhero. Just a quiet figure holding an umbrella, watching over them. She handed it to him. "It's yours," she said. Keanu took the sketch, and for a long moment, he couldn't speak. "Thank you," he finally whispered. "This means more than you know." As they walked back to the car, Emily suddenly stopped. "That night outside the restaurant, I think about it a lot." Keanu looked at her. "Yeah. I was ready to give up. I didn't know what was next. I just knew I was tired. And cold. And alone. But then, you stopped. You saw me. You didn't ask what I had done wrong. You just sat beside me like I mattered." Keanu's voice was quiet. "Because you did. You changed everything," she said. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Some things don't need words. 3 months later, the article had faded from the front pages. The photos had stopped circulating. The attention drifted elsewhere, as it always does. But the story had not ended. In a small community center in Eastley, Emily stood before a group of students holding her sketchbook. She was leading her very first art class, volunteering through the same program that had helped her. "My name is Emily," she said, her voice steady. "I used to think I wasn't worth much, but I've learned that even broken stories are worth telling." In the back of the room, watching quietly, stood Keanu Reeves. He didn't take photos. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, proud. After the class, Emily ran over and hugged him. Not because she needed saving, but because she had become strong enough to stand on her own, and he had walked beside her just long enough for her to believe she could. As they walked outside into the golden evening light, Keanu turned to her. "You know," he said, "you're not the same girl I met in the rain." "I know," she said, grinning. "Neither are you."